So this webinar is going to be on organic disease control. And I think a lot of folks wonder why they should grow organic or what's the difference between organic and conventional. And I think there's some big reasons why folks may want to grow organic, just because they might be concerned about chemicals on their food. And, or they're concerned, they don't want food that's been sprayed. But I just want to point out that organic produce at the grocery store is often sprayed with fungicides and pesticides. They're just organic certified sprays. Folks may be concerned about the environment, and I do think organic gardening is better for the environment, which isn't to say that there isn't ways that conventional farming and gardening can't be sustainable and good for the environment. I think organic kind of centers on being environmentally friendly. And we're going to talk about organic sprays in this workshop, and they are generally less toxic than a lot of the synthetic conventional sprays out there, but they're not totally non-toxic. And I just want to emphasize that you need to be conscious that anytime you're using any kind of gardening spray, conventional or organic, you need to take safety precautions. So we'll talk about that in this workshop. And you can definitely grow conventionally or organically without the use of sprays at all, but we'll talk in this next slide, in the slide after this, why you might want to spray or why I recommend spraying certain things at certain times. So what is organic? Organic must be derived from natural ingredients, so not man-made ingredients. So in disease control, this generally means it's some kind of mineral, it's a plant oil or some kind of plant derivative, or it's a biological organism like a patented strain of bacteria. Conventional sprays are often made from fossil fuel byproducts like petroleum and coal ash. And these are pretty nasty, and all these industries are bad for the environment. So folks generally want to grow organic because they're concerned, about what's going on their food and what's going on in the environment. So these are why you might want to grow organic. And do you need to spray? The answer is no. Sorry, my phone just rang. I'm gonna turn this off. You don't need to spray. However, we live in a really hot, humid, or the summers in our region are really hot and humid, and our winters are pretty mild, which means that pests and the diseases don't necessarily die over winter. So we play host to just about every garden disease and insect pest imaginable. And as a result, sprays can help you get more food out of your garden because you're going to keep your plants alive longer by using them. So, but you still need, even though they're organic sprays, you still need to use them responsibly. And I'm going to emphasize that throughout this entire workshop. Okay. Any questions about synthetic or conventional versus organic at this point?
There weren't specifically any questions about that, but there were a few from before when you started.
Okay.
One was from Justin. For harvest totals, do we record things we harvest from the garden that were not provided through BIU?
Yes, I would appreciate that because we're trying to support your whole garden this year, whether we provide a specific plant or not. So yeah, I would appreciate you tracking everything you harvest this year.
And then the other one was, what are T-posts for?
Good question. Yeah, this is a little harder this year because normally when I hand these out, I'm there to at the workshop and I demonstrate how to do this. But a T-post is for trellising. So you will, basically you can trellis your plants upwards. So like your tomatoes and your cucumbers and your pole beans can go up off the ground. And that saves space in your garden because they're growing upwards and not outwards. And then we'll also talk about in this presentation how trellising helps with disease control in your garden. So I talked a little bit about trellising in the previous workshop. And I'm also going to be, and you can see that video on our YouTube channel, the Build It Up YouTube channel. And then also I'm going to be making a few more videos for our YouTube channel this week about trellising specifically. So there'll be a little more information about that. Hopefully you can figure it out. But yeah, basically they are for trellising. You want to space them out in your garden about 5 feet apart. I don't want to get too much into it. I'll make a video and I'll share them. I'll email them out so folks can really see the different kinds of trellising you can do in your garden with T-posts. Does that answer that, hopefully? Okay. I will move on. Keep typing questions as you need them though. All right, so in organic gardening and in gardening in general, prevention of disease is key. And your best tool for gardening is prevention. Once a plant becomes infected with a disease, there's not really a cure for it. So you just need to you'll have to remove the plant and destroy it so that the pathogen doesn't spread. And by destroy, I mean trash it or burn it. Don't put it in your compost, because if you put a diseased plant in your compost, you run the risk of spreading or the disease getting into your compost. And then when you spread the compost on your garden, you're just putting the disease back in your garden. So that's really your option once something has become infected. So prevention has 2 parts to it. There are cultural practices, which I'm going to talk about first, and then there are the sprays, which I'll talk about in the second part of the workshop. So these are your tools for prevention, which is to build up healthy soil, create good airflow through trellising and other methods, dial in your watering, select disease-resistant varieties, clean your materials, clean up your garden, and then practicing crop rotation. I'm going to go through each of these. So building healthy soil. So healthy soil grows healthy plants. And there are folks that talk about soil health saying that, you're not trying to grow plants, you're really trying to grow healthy soil. And by growing healthy soil, the soil is going to support healthy plants. So I talk a lot about soil health in the August workshop, but I also try to talk a little bit about it at each of our workshops, because it is really important, and it's the key towards doing organic gardening successfully, is really focusing on soil health. So there are 5 principles of soil health, which is to reduce soil disturbances. This means tilling as little as possible or converting into a no-till system. I'll talk a lot about that at the August workshop. And it also means building permanent planting areas and permanent walking paths, and then trying not to step into your planting area so you can reduce the amount of compaction that happens. Principle 2 is keeping your soil covered, and this means using lots of mulch or row cover, and this also means using cover crops over the winter so that there's not bare soil at any time. Rotating crops, I also talk about that in another slide, so I'll skip that for now. Keep living roots in the soil. So anytime you're not growing a crop, that you want to have a cover crop growing. And I'll, again, cover all of this in August. So if these words just sound a little bit like gibberish, we will dive in depth into soil health in August. And then the 5th principle is to incorporate livestock, but I've kind of simplified that as use compost and composted animal manures. Anytime I talk about animal manure these days, I have to mention a caveat, which is that you have to be really careful about manure coming from an outside source. It's not your animals that you're getting it from. Just be aware that there are these persistent herbicides these days that can survive the animal's digestive system, come out in the manure, and then if you put that on your garden with that herbicide in it, it will kill all your plants. So just be totally aware that that's a thing. Plant-based compost is probably a little safer at this point. Okay, so was there a question about that? What happens if I click it? Oh.
Yeah.
I see it.
What are your thoughts about using a broad fork in a no-till system?
Yeah, I think it's good if you're starting out in a no-till system, to broad fork, and then if you think that there is any compaction going on, you can use a broad fork. A broad fork's just like it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a really giant fork-like thing that you stand on and you wiggle it around to aerate the soil. Yeah, so it's good. It's also a lot of work, and I know folks that kind of use it to establish their beds and then they don't use it again. So that's up to you. On the persistent herbicide, do you know if they're generally used locally? Yeah, no, there was a llama farm that folks in Jonesboro were getting manure from, and she was composting the manure. It was great, but then she purchased hay from another farm, and that hay field had been sprayed with these broadleaf herbicides, and I forget the brand name, but you can look it up. And it destroyed a lot of gardens, actually. So this was just probably 4 or 5 years ago that this happened. So it's not just that the farmer themselves may not be spraying their fields, but they may be purchasing hay from someone who is spraying for these broadleaf herbicides. This stuff is available locally to purchase. People are spraying it. It sucks that this is happening, but just be really careful about that, because it'll persist. Once it's on your soil, it'll persist for 3 to 5 years before it finally breaks down. So it can be pretty devastating that way. Yeah. Okay.
There's another question in the chat. If you don't buy organic produce, should you not put food waste in your compost?
I am not that finicky about it. I think it's fine. If you're like certified organic, so if you're a certified organic farm, then then you can't, and you're making your own compost, then yeah, you can't put anything that's not certified organic into your compost. But, sorry, I'm reading questions now. But as a home gardener, I wouldn't worry about that too much. What can we ask our hay guys specifically to avoid that? So talking about the persistent herbicide, just ask if they spray anything. They'll tell you they should. And generally, if you're going to spray a hay field, you're going to spray these broadleaf herbicides. And if they'll tell you the brand name, then you can look it up and see if it's going to be a problem for the manure. And Vanessa asked, can hay that we purchase for mulching contain it too? Possibly, but I've not. Oh, you know what? I don't buy hay for mulching. I buy straw, and most straw is not going to be sprayed with that. So, if you're purchasing hay locally from the farmer, you could ask. Probably from a big box store if you're buying hay or straw for mulching. Probably not been sprayed. Okay, I'm going to keep going. All right. So creating good airflow, and again, if you can see this picture, these tomatoes are trellised up. They look like they're on wooden stakes, but it's the same idea as just getting the plants up off the ground, and you can do this with cucumbers, tomatoes, whole beans, and then some small melons and squash can also be trellised upwards. If it's a really big squash or melon, it'll be too heavy for the trellising. But and you want to put adequate spacing between plants. There's a technique out there called square foot gardening. I think that that technique specifically tries to cram plants too close together. So I don't encourage folks to use that. I want you to put a little bit more spacing between plants. That method may be fine if you're in the Northeast or you're in California or something, but it's just too humid here. We need a little more space between plants. So a little more space is better than a little less space. Minimize weeds. Weeds are just bad in general because they will compete with your plants for nutrients and water. And if they get out of control and it becomes a jungle, then they are blocking air circulation around your plants. So they're bad for that. And then, especially with tomatoes, I like to keep the bottom foot or so of the plant heavily pruned. I leave the top parts kind of, I just usually let them go, but I don't want any leaves touching the soil. So you can see in this picture also that the leaves have been pruned off. So it looks like there's probably more than a foot on this plant, but at least a foot, and then no leaves touching the soil at all. And that can really help with disease prevention. Dial in watering. Too much water in your garden helps spread disease. Too little can stress your plants out, make them more susceptible to disease. So just trying to hit that 1 inch a week of watering, if it's not raining, is really helpful. I talk a lot about watering in the previous webinar. So you can find that on our YouTube channel. I've posted the whole video. So you can hear all about how to do proper watering in your garden. Using mulch under your plants to help prevent rain splashing on your soil. Probably the only thing missing in this picture of the tomatoes is a good layer of mulch down here. That would really help conserve water, and also to help prevent raindrops from splashing water splashing soil onto the plant. There's soil-borne diseases out there that will transfer from the soil to the plant via water. If you are using overhead irrigation, to water early in the morning if you can, so the leaves have time to dry out, and then using a drip irrigation system if you have that as an option. But again, check out, if you didn't see the last webinar or you need a refresher, please check out our YouTube channel for that video. Okay, using disease-resistant plants is another really key one, and I spend a lot of time, for the Build It Up gardeners, I spend a lot of time researching plant varieties that are disease-resistant so that we're handing out, hopefully, the most disease-resistant varieties that we can provide, that we can afford. When you get into these hybrids that have a lot of disease resistance, you tend to pay more for them, which makes sense because they're very heavily, intensely bred. So someone's got to get paid for that. So if you know you have recurrent issues with something each year, then you can select seed and plant varieties that are resistant to that thing. And this is especially important for tomatoes, all kinds of squash, so winter and summer squash, and then cucumbers are the ones that I really focus on. I do provide some heirlooms varieties of these, but I do tend to favor hybrids for these, just because I want you to have plants, as long as you can. And these disease-resistant packages are pretty key to that. So this is an example of a tomato variety out there, and it is, so you can see it's a Iron Lady. F1 means it's a hybrid, and then HR means highly resistant, and it has these codes. Generally, the catalog that you're looking at will explain what, we'll have a key code for what all these different disease-resistant letterings mean, but this, I think, is early blight, Fusarium wilt, late blight, Septoria leaf spot, and verticillium wilt. So this would be an excellent tomato. I looked up the price on this thing, and I think it's like $6 for like 10 seeds. So it's a pretty expensive tomato. However, it's probably going to be there till the end of the season producing tomatoes. Actually, no, it's a determinant. So it's going to produce all its tomatoes at once and then be done. Never mind. But it will stay alive to finish producing all of those fruit. But anyway, and you can see some information. This was bred in collaboration with Cornell and North Carolina State University. And I like to see that it was bred by NC State, because that means it was bred for, conditions in the Southeast. So really trying to favor, or if you can find varieties that have been bred, in the South, then that it's going to be good for the conditions that we face. So in the time of COVID, I think we are all aware of how important it is to keep your hands clean. And this is also true in the garden when you're dealing with plant diseases, because it is possible to transmit diseases between plants. If you are trying to prune off some leaves that look like they're dying, and then you take, you prune one plant, and then you go to the next plant and you start pruning that, you could be transmitting disease from one plant to the other. So having some alcohol wipes with you as you go through the garden, and then cleaning your pruners between plants is important. Your shoes can transmit soil diseases between fields, between gardens. If you went and visited, someone else's garden and you were walking around and they had a bad disease problem, and then you came home and just walked around your garden in those same shoes, that could be an issue. And then I just like to mention this every year, that there is a virus called tobacco mosaic virus that is in cigarettes and in tobacco, and that gets on your hands, your fingers. And so if you smoke, or someone smokes and then they go out and they touch their garden without washing their hands, they can transmit the tobacco mosaic virus to their plants. So this is especially, it can hit tomato, anything in the nightshade family, so tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, eggplants. So don't let smokers into your garden unless they have thoroughly washed their hands to try to prevent this virus from getting out. Okay, clean up your garden. So on a bigger scale, again, just be vigilant about any diseased plants and getting them out immediately. Don't put the infected plant material into your compost. Clean up your garden at the end of each season to remove any infected material. Don't let weeds thrive, because there are weeds that play host to various diseases. So you really want to clean them out as much as you can, not let them get out of control. If you do compost, and you can get a compost thermometer, and I think it's 140 degrees that your compost needs to reach for like 3 days, I think. And if it does that, it will kill diseased plant material. So if you are vigilant about composting, if you're very good at it, and you are monitoring your temperature of your compost pile, you may be able to get away with putting in, plant material that may or may not be infected. But unless you're like really good at composting, it's probably best not to fool around with it and just get it out, so you're not reinfecting your garden next year when you spread your compost. And then crop rotation, which I mentioned in an earlier slide, but basically this is don't plant the same crop in the same spot year after year. You want a minimum of 3 years between crop families. And this means, so if you have tomatoes in a certain spot, for the next 3 years, you can't put in any peppers, potatoes, eggplants, anything in the nightshade family can't be in that same spot, or shouldn't be in that same spot, because they share diseases. So you rotate in other plant families into that location. So some of the major plant families are nightshades, so that's tomatoes, potatoes, that kind of stuff. Brassicas, that's all of your cabbage, kale, broccoli, those crops. Cucurbits are your squash and your cucumbers. Legumes are your beans and your peas. So that's 4 major crop families. So you could just have a 4-year rotation pretty easily by just rotating those crops in each spot. So each year you shift them over a row or something, so that they're just not sharing the same soil year after year. And so this is especially important for soil-borne diseases. Most diseases feed off of one type of plant or one type of plant family. And so if you plant the same thing in the same spot year after year, you're just feeding that disease over and over, and you're letting it multiply and get out of control. Crop rotation serves to starve those pathogens because they don't have their food. And so in 3 or 4 years, when you put that crop back in that spot, hopefully that disease, if there was anything there, is gone, because it starved to death. Okay, that is the last slide for the prevention. Are there any questions? Where do I buy my straw? I bought straw this year from Mize up in Gray. They had a pretty good price on it. Apparently it's been out of stock in a lot of places. So I know I have in past years bought it from some local farms, so you can check on Craigslist, or I think it was Sunset View Farm out in Boones Creek had straw a couple years ago that I bought from. So you can generally find it. I mean, this year is kind of weird, so I'm not sure what's available. But I did get it from Mize this year. Okay. All right, moving on. So identifying organic products, how do you know if something's organic? Generally, it costs more than the other products around it. It costs more because it costs a lot of money to become certified organic. So, and generally because they're not synthetic, they're made from natural materials, so they're a little hard to process. So that's why things cost a little more. But you can tell it's organic because it has the USDA organic seal on it. You also may see something that's the OMRI seal. And the OMRI website, omri.org, is great because if you're uncertain whether a product is organic or a certain ingredient is organic, you can look it up on the OMRI database and see if it's safe for organic farming or gardening. And then you'll probably notice that some conventional products will have the same active ingredient as an organic product, like a copper-based fungicide, or like a slug bait. They may both have the same active ingredient on them, but it's the non-active ingredients that may also be of concern. So anything that's organic certified must be naturally derived. And so while that copper spray, the main ingredient may be the same, it's the non-active ingredients, which they're not necessarily required to list what else is in there. Those may be concerning. So and if you can afford it, if it's fine for you, then I would say stick with organic certified products in your garden, just so you know that stuff is naturally derived. All right, we're going to get into sprays more deeply, different kinds of sprays, how to use them. So again, organic sprays are mostly preventative. Once a disease is in a plant, there's not really a cure. You need to get it out of the garden. And then for highly susceptible crops like tomatoes and cucurbits, it's probably best to set a schedule either from planting, or if you're out there every day, scouting for signs of disease. As soon as you see any kind of disease issues, to start spraying to make sure that it doesn't spread. And then really please follow package directions on all of your sprays. For the stuff we'll be handing out, I'll email out all of the material safety data sheets so you have all that information on hand, so you can reference them anytime you need to use what we'll be handing out on Wednesday. And I'll mention specifically what we're handing out as we go through all this. So again, organic sprays are generally safer, but they're not totally non-toxic. You need to mix at the ratio recommended on the bottle or on the material safety data sheets. So it says maybe a tablespoon per quart is what they say to mix at. Don't think, well, if a tablespoon's good, then a whole cup is better. That's not how this works. You need to follow the directions so that you stay safe. When you do spray, it's best to wear long sleeve clothes, shirts and pants, closed toe shoes and gloves. So you're making sure that it doesn't get on your skin. If you're spraying at face level, like you're trying to spray a fruit tree or something, wear a mask and goggles so you're not going to get in your face and eyes or your mouth and eyes. And I would just go ahead and assume that these sprays are toxic to bees and beneficial insects. They may or may not be. And so it's best to just avoid spraying anytime that these insects might be out. So trying to get up very early in the morning. I generally don't wake up early enough to beat the bees to their flowers. They're up pretty early. So I tend to spray when I need to spray late in the evening when the bees have gone home for the day. Don't spray when there's any winds, and that makes sure that you are only spraying your plants and that it's not drifting onto something else. And don't dump leftover material into the environment or into an open sewer grate or anything like that. Please follow the storage and disposal directions listed on the material safety data sheets and the instructions. All right, so there are three different kinds of three general kinds of sprays out there. There are mineral-based sprays, there are these plant-based botanical sprays, and then there are the biological sprays. So for your mineral sprays, there's copper, which I like. It's cheap. It's very effective. You can apply it every 1 to 2 weeks, and after it rains a really hard rain. You can over apply copper if you don't follow the directions, the application rates, and if you over apply it, it can lead to a copper buildup in the soil, which can be toxic for your plants. There's also sulfur. This is mostly used in the wine industry or in vineyards. Sulfur can make your soil more acidic if it's over applied. I don't recommend that you necessarily fool around with sulfur. I just don't think you need it. Copper does a great job. If you're looking for a mineral spray, there's also potassium bicarbonate, which is not new, but I feel like it's being used more than it has in the past. It's been studied to be very effective on powdery mildew, and it's now being labeled for other fungal diseases. It's pretty non-toxic, and it can be sprayed weekly. So I haven't seen it locally, but if you find it, you want to look for something that's like 85% potassium bicarbonate as your active ingredient. But that might be a good one to look into if you're worried about toxicity. These botanical-based sprays, neem oil is a really popular one. It's not only is it a fungicide, but it's also a mild insecticide, so it can help control some pest insects, and it has some benefits for plant growth. It's very popular among organic gardeners. You can apply it every 10 to 14 days. I really prefer to use a full spectrum or a cold pressed neem oil. A lot of stuff that you can buy locally is like they've extracted a lot of different chemicals out of it, and they basically are just packaging up and selling the leftovers to you as a fungicide. So I really encourage you, if you are going to use neem oil, to find something that is a full spectrum neem oil, so that you get all the good stuff in the neem and are not just buying a leftover product. Another botanical one is thyme oil. I haven't seen this around, but you can purchase it online. It's a fungicide and also an insecticide, just like the neem oil. But apparently it works for a pretty long time because you can apply it every 20 days, which may have its benefits. Again, it's not very common. It's probably pretty expensive. So the neem oil would be a better option. And then
There's a question, do you spray before you see a problem?
You can, especially for tomatoes, squash, and cucumbers, because on those plants, you will definitely have problems. There are probably 40 or 50 different kinds of diseases that impact tomatoes, and your plants will get hit by them. So starting when you put them in the ground, you can just start with a weekly spray application according to the package directions on it. But if you don't want to start spraying immediately, again, if you get out there every day and you are observing your plants, and so you can start spraying at the first sign of disease. And I'll show, there's some future slides about different diseases, common diseases, so you can kind of get some pictures as to what you're looking at when you see a disease problem. So there's two options. You can set a spray schedule immediately on planting, or you can wait until you see the first signs of a problem. So yes, either way. Okay. So biological sprays, This is usually a patented strain of bacteria that some company has found. And there are a whole lot of different name brands out there, and they vary in price from things that are quite affordable, like the Serenade is very affordable, to things that are, hundreds of dollars for what seems like a very tiny quantity of fungicide. So there's a lot out there. Basically, these sprays use a beneficial strain of bacteria to kind of colonize the leaf surface of your plant, so it crowds out or it attacks the bad bacteria or fungi trying to kill your plant. So I think they're pretty effective. They're pretty non-toxic because it's just a bacteria that only affects the leaf surface of the plant. It's not going to impact you or your health. You can also make your own kind of biological spray at home if you look up instructions online for making compost tea. I've read some really good things about compost tea, and I've seen some presentations at various organic conferences about compost tea, and one of these days I'll get around to brewing it myself, but I haven't yet. But if you are feeling adventurous or you are really bored and stuck at home with your children, then maybe a fun compost tea experiment is right up your alley. And then again, so the Serenade, we will be handing out some Serenade on Wednesday to folks. So, and I'm pretty sure you can buy it locally, like at Mize or at a gardening store, maybe Evergreen. I've not really looked. We get ours from Springs up in Virginia. We get it shipped to us. Okay. Did we have a question?
No, just someone having connection issues.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. So best practices, I think, to get the most out of your spraying, that you pick 2 types. So there's 3 types: mineral, botanical, biological. So pick 2 of those and then alternate each week. So like you could take Serenade and you could get some copper fungicide and alternate each. So one week you spray Serenade, the next week you spray copper, and back and forth. This reduces the chance that the pathogens will build up an immunity to any one of these sprays, because they have different mechanisms for controlling pathogens. So if the fungi or bacteria builds up a resistance to one, then they'll be killed by the other because it's a different mechanism attacking them. And this is the same for insecticides. We're going to talk about next month. The workshop is going to be on organic pest control. So it's the same thing. You want to pick 2 and alternate them. And this helps also, with the way that copper can build up in your soil. So if you're using a different fungicide, or even 2 different fungicides, or 3 different fungicides in rotation, then that's less copper you're spraying and less likely for it to build up. Did we have another question?
Yes.
Okay, asking about, no, it's probably a different type of borer. So she says her elderberries have a borer in them, and then worried about, will the squash get the borer? So it's a different insect. It's probably specific to elderberries because the squash vine borer that gets into squash is very specific to squash. So they generally don't overlap. There are a few, especially invasive species coming from other countries. A lot of those will eat eat a lot of different plants in your garden, but usually native stuff just sticks to one thing, even though it's pretty devastating. So don't worry about the borers in your elderberry getting into your garden. Okay, and we will talk a lot more about insects next month. All right, so there's different ways that diseases can get into your garden. So that's different vectors. So infected seed and plant material, insects will bring it in. It can come in through weeds. It can just be in the soil already. it can float in on the wind. And then human vectors, again, you know, your tools or your shoes, or if you're smoking, the tobacco mosaic virus can get in on your hands. So just kind of understanding where a disease is coming into your garden can help you with preventing and controlling it. There are 3 types of diseases. I mean, these are the same things that infect humans and everything else, but viruses, they generally come in through insects and infected plant and seed material. Bacteria, which thrives in moisture and humidity, can come in on insects, soil, and wind. Fungi, you know, fungi need some kind of living or decaying host in order to replicate. And they are possibly our biggest challenge in this region. We have a lot of fungal diseases. They really thrive in our moist, humid environments. So bacteria and fungi are the big ones. Viruses, you can't really do anything except remove the plant. If it gets in, I mean, you can try to control the insect host if you know what it is from getting out of control in your garden, but once you get a virus in a plant, there's really nothing you can do except get the plant out as fast as you can. So I'm going to go through some slides of common diseases. This is not a complete list. There are lots and lots of diseases out there that are going to infect your plants. And I'll talk a little bit about if you are having trouble identifying a disease, you know, some ways that you can figure out what's going on. So downy and powdery mildews, these diseases are not related, but they kind of go into the same category. So this is the downy mildew. It's kind of the brown, crunchy, crusty one. And then the powdery mildew looks like someone dropped, you know, baby powder on the leaf. So these are really common on squash and cucumbers. There's also a variety of downy mildew that affects basil. They don't cross over. The basil downy mildew is not going to infect your cucumbers, but it is pretty common on basil. And these are spread by the wind, and so you can prevent them by having good airflow, planting earlier in the season, planting resistant varieties, especially for powdery mildew. There's a lot of varieties out there with powdery mildew resistance. There are some with downy mildew resistance, but that's a little more rare. But there are breeding, especially again out of Cornell University, downy mildew resistant plant varieties that are getting bred. Yeah, and especially for squash and cucumbers, planting for successions. That means having more crops ready to go in the ground when the older crops are dying, and then covering those new plants with some row cover. Now, unfortunately, cucumbers and squash need to be pollinated by bees. So you can't leave the row cover on there for the whole season. You won't get any pollination. So as soon as you see flowers, you have to uncover them. But at least if you cover them for the first few weeks, then they get to grow without too much disease pressure on them. And then you can have a spray schedule again with the Serenade. You could do copper, you could do potassium bicarbonate, are all effective. And then, you know, spray at the first signs of disease and spray weekly after that.
Have you ever heard of spraying Listerine or a cheaper substitute? Ingredients include thyme and menthol.
No, I never heard of anyone spraying Listerine on their plants. Especially since that's like I think, isn't that like an alcohol-based product? Correct me if I'm wrong. Lynn, are you on? Have you ever heard of this? Are you there? Maybe not. Okay. I would not personally spray Listerine. It does have thyme and menthol, but it's probably not in the concentrations that you would need to have an effective disease control. The alcohol may burn the plants, and then who knows what else is in there. So, yeah, I would not trust that personally. So late blight is another biggie on tomatoes. This is a pretty devastating disease. Once you notice that you have late blight, your plants are probably dead. That's how fast it kills in a day or two. It really hits nightshades, tomatoes, potatoes. It can hit some other plants too. It comes in on the wind, and some years, a lot of years, I don't see late blight at all. Other years, it just gets really bad and really out of control, and it's just pouring in, from all directions, and you're just kind of left with, unless you have plants that are resistant to it, it kills tomatoes pretty quickly. And so it's always good to have at least one variety. If you're planting multiple varieties of tomatoes, at least one variety that has some late blight resistance bred into it. That way, if it does come through, you still have at least that one variety to keep you going. And then if you do have some issues with late blight, to get that material, you get those plants out of your garden, and at the end of the year to really clean up your tomato patch really good. And then you can try to control it with Serenade and copper, or try to prevent it that way. But this one particularly is kind of hard, and it comes on suddenly, and then in a lot of years you don't see it. So I don't worry too much about it, but just be aware that it can come in and kill everything suddenly. The Septoria leaf spot, I see this every year on the plants, and it just kind of gradually, these spots spread and spread and spread. It's not really deadly to the plant. A lot of times, especially on indeterminate tomatoes, they just keep growing and they kind of outgrow the Septoria leaf spot. So if you have a high enough trellis, they just keep going. It can slow fruit development, and it can, as the leaves fall off, it can lead to sun scald on the fruits, which will ruin the tomatoes. Just try to prune off infected leaves as best you can. Again, practice good sanitation on your garden tools, so you're not spreading the disease from plant to plant. And then, if you're already spraying copper or Serenade weekly, this will help prevent any problems. So there's a couple of kinds of wilts out there, and I know Fusarium has a couple of different strains. I don't know about Verticillium, but the Fusarium, you can kind of see it does this like yellowing of the plant before it starts turning brown and crispy, and then the Verticillium, it just kind of starts out brown and crispy like that. So they affect a lot of different plants. The Fusarium especially, it can hit cabbage, it can hit tomatoes, lettuce, all kinds of different plants. So, and it persists in the soil for years once it's established, so that it's not something that you can fix with crop rotation. It's just kind of there. So if you are having a lot of issues with wilt, choosing resistant varieties is probably your best bet. And there are a lot of breeds of tomatoes, especially that are resistant to Fusarium wilt. Mulch might help, but not if it's coming up through the roots. And then I've seen some stuff online about solarizing the soil, and that just means laying down black or clear plastic. Basically cook your soil with the sun during the summer. You will also fry your good soil life, but that may be worth it if you're just having a lot of issues with the soil-borne diseases. So that may be worth something to try if you're having a lot of issues. Early blight is another one that I see almost every year, and you can tell, you can identify early blight pretty easily because it forms these bullseye lesions on the leaves of the plants. So that's early blight, and this is a bacterial disease, whereas the late blight is I think a fungal disease. It's again affects tomatoes mostly, some other nightshades. I generally just see it on tomatoes though. You can, it's not as deadly as late blight by any means. It's not related to late blight at all. And you can control it somewhat through pruning. But if it gets out of control, it can kind of affect the fruit quality too. And this mulch will help if you prevent, around the base of the plants, it'll prevent soil from splashing up on the leaves, use some drip irrigation. Don't going into your garden and touching your plants when it's wet. And then there's also a lot of varieties out there that are resistant. And then again, the copper and serenade or any kind of fungicide sprayed weekly should help. Soft spot. This is a rot on your, or soft rot rather, is a rot on root crops. Waiting until things warm up a bit before you plant. Making sure that you purchase disease-free seeds. This is an important one. I mean, technically, you could go to the grocery store and get a bag of potatoes and plant those in your garden, and they would probably grow potato plants, but they may transmit. They're not certified disease-free the way that seed potatoes are from, from a garden store, or if you purchase them from a seed company. They will test their potatoes to make sure that they're not carrying diseases. So that's one way to do it. Rotating your crops, building healthy soil, and then don't let crops sit in the ground. Excuse me. Once they've matured, just getting them out as soon as they're ready, so they're not sitting in there. Bacterial wilt. Sorry if I'm going kind of fast. I know this is just a lot of information, and these slides. I'll send up a slide so you can kind of review them. But I just want to. It's 7 o'clock, so I just want to get through this. Cucumbers, you can see the wilted leaves here. This is transmitted by these lovely little cucumber beetles. There's two different varieties of cucumber beetles. There's the striped one and the spotted ones. And it's transmitted by when they chew on your plants. There is some disease-resistant varieties out there, but really trying to control the cucumber beetles is best, using row cover to keep them off of the plants. Surround is a sprayable kaolin clay product that can keep them off. You spray the leaves and they don't like it. It makes them itchy, so they don't land on your plants. The cucumber mosaic virus. I don't have a picture of the tobacco mosaic virus, but it does kind of a similar modeling. So when you see the fruits or the leaves turn this kind of mottled colors, you've got some kind of mosaic virus going on. This is transmitted by aphids. It actually infects a lot of different plants out there. Again, there's nothing you can do for viruses except get the plants out of the garden or choose disease-resistant varieties. Anthracnose is another one I see a lot in the garden, and that's just these kind of bullseye lesions, but they're on the fruit rather than the leaves. And you can usually just prune the fruit off that's infected. If the whole plant if there are multiple fruits on the plant that are infected, I'd probably just pull the plant up and get it out, so it's not transmitting the bacteria to other plants in your garden. Again, using drip irrigation, using trellises to keep plants and fruits off the ground, and serenade and copper are good. Okay, that was a lot, and that was probably just scratching the surface of plant garden diseases. This is a really great website, the Cornell Vegetable MD online website. Has just a bunch of different, it's separated out by vegetables, and then you can look up different diseases, or there's lots of pictures to help you kind of identify what's going on. If you're really struggling to identify what the problem is and you're really having a hard time, UT Extension offers testing of plant samples, and they have pretty detailed instructions for how to get a plant sample to the lab for testing. The plant still needs to be as alive as possible and as much material as you can get. So you need to follow the instructions for that, but it's only $15, and they'll hopefully be able to identify what is killing your plant. So that's kind of a useful thing if you're really struggling with something. Okay. All right. Thanks for watching. And I was trying to keep this at about an hour, and that's where we are. So any final questions, feel free to come off of mute if you want, and we can chat. I'm going to turn off the recording.